In 2019, a team of scientists pulled 250 bottles of water out of a Scottish lake and, without ever catching sight of a single creature, ended a debate that had run for nearly a century. But here is the part almost nobody talked about afterward: the same results that closed one mystery quietly opened another one, and that second mystery has never been resolved. Stick with this video, because what these scientists actually found in the water is stranger, and far more interesting, than the monster everyone grew up hearing about. To understand why this study mattered, you first have to understand the lake itself, because Loch Ness was never an ordinary body of water. It sits inside the Great Glen Fault, a long crack in the earth that splits the Scottish Highlands from coast to coast. The loch was carved out along that fault during the last ice age, which makes it geologically young, but physically extreme. It stretches for roughly 23 miles, yet at its widest point it's barely a mile and a half across. What it lacks in width, it makes up for in depth. The average depth is over 400 feet, and the deepest surveyed point comes in at more than 700 feet, deeper than many skyscrapers are tall. By sheer volume, it holds more fresh water than every lake in England and Wales combined. The water itself works against anyone trying to see into it. Centuries of peat draining off the surrounding hills have stained the loch a deep, tea-like brown, and that discoloration kills visibility fast. Below about 30 feet, divers and cameras alike are essentially blind. You could stand in a boat on a clear summer afternoon and lose sight of your own anchor line a few feet under the surface. That single fact, more than any legend, is why Loch Ness has resisted a clean answer for so long. It doesn't need a monster to hide something. It hides everything, all the time, simply by being what it is. The legend itself is older than most people realize, though the earliest reference is far shakier than the modern story suggests. Back in the 7th century, a monk named Adomnan wrote a biography of Saint Columba that described the saint calming a water beast in the River Ness, the river that flows out of the loch. It's a nice story, but it was written more than 100 years after Columba died, for the specific purpose of proving his holiness, and it reads like the religious literature it is. After that, there's essentially nothing for over 1,000 years. No consistent sightings, no ongoing folklore about a creature in the loch. Just silence. The modern phenomenon starts in the 1930s, and the timing is not a coincidence. A new road had just been built along the northern shore of the loch, which meant, for the first time, ordinary travelers had a clear, elevated view of the water from their cars rather than a brief glimpse from a footpath or a passing boat. In the spring of 1933, a local hotel manager reported seeing something large moving in the loch, and a nearby journalist ran the story using the word monster. A few months later, a couple driving along that same new road claimed they'd seen a large creature actually cross in front of their car and vanish into the water. That story ran in newspapers across the country, and by the end of the year, Loch Ness had a monster in the public imagination, one that hasn't really left since. Within months, tourists were arriving specifically hoping to catch a glimpse of it, and that public appetite is part of why the story never faded the way most local folklore eventually does. A legend usually needs an audience to survive, and by late 1933, Loch Ness had won on a national scale. What happened next did real damage to the credibility of the whole subject, and it's worth being honest about it. A big game hunter was hired by a British newspaper to track down the creature, and within days he announced he'd found giant footprints on the shore. When the casts were sent to the Natural History Museum, the verdict came back almost immediately: the prints had been made by a dried hippopotamus foot, the kind sometimes mounted as an umbrella stand. It was, to put it plainly, a hoax, and an embarrassing one. Then, in 1934, the most famous image in the entire history of the legend appeared, the so-called surgeon's photograph, showing a long, slender neck rising out of the water. For 60 years, that single photo was treated as the closest thing to proof the world had. It wasn't proof. In the early 1990s, One of the men connected to the original hippopotamus foot hoax admitted on his deathbed that the surgeon's photograph had been staged using a toy submarine fitted with a sculpted head, built specifically to embarrass the newspaper that had humiliated him years earlier. The most iconic image connected to the Loch Ness monster had been a prank for 6 decades before anyone admitted it. Given that start, it would be reasonable to assume the whole subject was nothing but hoaxes and misidentified logs. But that's not quite fair either, because alongside the fabrications, there were reports that were much harder to wave away. In 1960, an aeronautical engineer with no history of hoaxing filmed something moving across the surface of the loch. When the footage was reviewed years later by a Royal Air Force Photographic Intelligence Unit, their conclusion was that the object was probably an animate object of some size, not a boat, not a wave, and not a known optical trick. Through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, a dedicated research group ran a long-term shore watch, logging sighting after sighting without ever reaching a firm identification. In the 1970s, an American inventor working with a Boston-based Science Academy led underwater photography expeditions that produced 2 images that briefly made global headlines, one showing what looked like a flipper. Years later, when researchers compared the raw, unprocessed frames to the versions that had actually been published, it became clear the images had been heavily retouched, and the originals showed far less than the public had been told. By the late 1980s, the pattern was familiar: intriguing footage on one side, embarrassing fabrications on the other, and no instrument-based investigation large enough to settle anything either way. That changed in 1987 with an operation that, for the first time, tried to scan the entire loch systematically rather than relying on a single boat or a single camera. 24 boats, each carrying sonar equipment, formed a line stretching across the full width of the loch and moved down its length together, sweeping the water column so thoroughly that almost no space below the surface went unchecked. The operation did not find a monster. It also did not come back empty. Sonar operators recorded 3 separate contacts in the middle of the water column, at depths where nothing solid should have been, and none of them could be matched to a known fish species large enough to explain them. They weren't floating debris. They weren't on the lake bed. They were moving, in open water, and to this day nobody has offered a confirmed explanation for what generated them. The naturalist who organized that sonar sweep has spent decades since then building what is now the most widely accepted mainstream explanation for the majority of Loch Ness sightings. And it has nothing to do with a hidden animal. Because the loch is so long, narrow, and deep, it produces surface behavior that doesn't happen in ordinary lakes. Wakes from boats can travel much farther and linger far longer than expected. Standing waves can persist on the surface long after whatever caused them has passed. Mats of vegetation occasionally break off the shoreline and drift across the open water, and from a distance, a floating mat can look uncannily like a moving back or hump. On top of that, seals are known to swim up the River Ness and into the loch itself from time to time, and a seal's head breaking the surface can look startlingly unfamiliar to someone who has never seen one there before. Combine all of that with a lake that already carries 90 years of monster folklore, and you get a steady supply of genuine, honest sightings by people who saw something real, just not what they assumed they saw. This explanation accounts for the overwhelming majority of reports. The honest, open question inside the field itself has always been whether it accounts for every single one. That open question is exactly what brought a team of geneticists to the loch in 2018, led by a professor from the University of Otago in New Zealand, with the goal of doing something no previous Loch Ness investigation had attempted at this scale: reading the genetic makeup of the entire lake at once. The method is called environmental DNA analysis, and it works on a simple biological principle. Every living thing that moves through water constantly sheds tiny traces of itself into that water, through skin cells, waste, mucus, and other biological material. You don't need to see an animal or catch it. You only need a sample of the water it swam through recently, because that water will carry its genetic signature. This technique wasn't invented for Loch Ness, and that matters, because it means the tool itself had already been tested and trusted long before anyone pointed it at a monster hunt. Environmental DNA sampling had been used for years in conservation biology, mainly to track endangered or invasive species moving through rivers and lakes without ever having to physically capture an animal. Scientists used it to detect rare amphibians hiding in remote wetlands and to catch early signs of invasive fish entering new territory before anyone ever spotted one in person. By the time it was applied to Loch Ness, it wasn't an experimental gimmick built around a legend. It was an established scientific method being pointed at one of the most famous unanswered questions in the world, and that combination is part of why the 2019 results carried so much weight the moment they were released. The team collected 250 water samples from multiple depths, spanning the entire length of the loch from one end to the other. Those samples were sealed on site and shipped to laboratories on different continents for sequencing, and the results were compared against global genetic databases covering essentially every species that has ever been formally recorded. In total, the analysis processed roughly 500 million individual DNA sequences and identified around 3,000 distinct species living in or around the loch, ranging from fish and insects to bacteria and plant life washed in from the surrounding hills. Loch Ness, it turns out, is a rich and biologically active freshwater system, exactly what its size and geology would predict. What it did not contain was any reptile DNA whatsoever. None, at any depth, anywhere along the length of the loch. That single result quietly ended the plesiosaur theory for good, and honestly, the biology had always made that theory shaky to begin with. Plesiosaurs were air-breathing marine reptiles that went extinct around 66 million years ago, and Loch Ness itself has only existed for about 10,000 years, formed at the end of the last ice age. There was never a continuous body of water that could have sheltered a surviving population across that entire span of time. The eDNA results simply confirmed what should have already been obvious. Alongside the reptile theory, several other long-running candidates were eliminated in the same sweep. No shark DNA turned up, ruling out the idea of some salt-tolerant species surviving in fresh water. No catfish DNA appeared, closing the door on the giant catfish theory. And no sturgeon DNA was found either, which mattered because giant sturgeon had long been considered the single most biologically plausible explanation among the classic candidates. In one study, decades of competing theories were eliminated at once. That was the headline. That was the part that ran in newspapers around the world within hours. Here's the part that didn't make the headlines. Buried in that same set of 500 million sequences was an enormous, unmistakable signal of European eel DNA, present at every single sample site, at every depth tested, in concentrations the research team had not expected going in. The loch, according to the data, is thick with eels. The lead researcher was careful to point out an important limitation of the technique, which is that environmental DNA can tell you a species is present and abundant, but it cannot tell you the size of the individual animals producing that signal. A normal European eel grows to roughly a meter in length. What the study could not rule out, and what the researcher himself acknowledged publicly, is the possibility that among that enormous eel population, some individuals could have grown far beyond the typical range. He was careful never to claim that a giant eel explains every sighting, or that one has ever actually been found. What he said was narrower and more honest than that. Of all the historical candidates people have proposed over 90 years, the unusually large eel population is the only one the data could not eliminate. That finding might have been the end of the story, except that in August 2023, the largest coordinated search of the loch since the 1970s took place, organized through the Loch Ness Centre together with a volunteer research group. Over a single weekend, the team deployed underwater hydrophones at depths and durations no earlier search had managed, paired with infrared drones scanning the surface for heat signatures that ordinary cameras might miss, alongside dozens of volunteers watching the shoreline. Once again, there was no visual sighting of anything unidentified. But the hydrophones picked up 4 distinct acoustic signals during the search that investigators were unable to match to any known source. They weren't boat engines. They weren't recorded fish sounds. They weren't wave noise against the shore. In the language of the report that followed, they were simply anomalous, and they remain unexplained. So here is where the actual science stands as of now, not the headline version, but the real one. The plesiosaur is gone, eliminated by direct genetic evidence, and by basic paleontology that never really supported it in the first place. The shark, the catfish, and the giant sturgeon are gone with it. The classic monster of postcards and souvenir shops, the long-necked reptile from a lost world, does not exist in that water, and the science on that point is about as settled as science gets. But sitting underneath that clean answer is a pile of evidence that has never been folded into a tidy explanation. 3 unexplained sonar contacts from 1987. 4 unexplained acoustic signals from 2023. A population of eels far larger than anyone had measured before, with a maximum possible size that the researchers themselves admitted they could not rule out. And 90 years of sightings from ordinary people, a good number of them credible, that a well-supported wake and vegetation explanation accounts for in bulk, but, by the honest admission of the researchers involved, not down to the very last case. That's the actual ending here, and it's a more interesting one than a simple yes or no. The 2019 study didn't find a monster, and it was never going to. But it also didn't hand back an empty lake. It handed back a lake that is deeper than most city skyscrapers are tall, invisible below 30 feet by simple physics, connected to the open sea by a navigable river, and packed with far more eel life than the textbooks had predicted. Whatever has been generating those unexplained sonar and hydrophone readings for decades, it is not a dinosaur, and the researchers who have spent their careers on this loch will tell you that plainly. What it actually is remains, by every measure of the published evidence, still an open question. Loch Ness gave up its most famous legend in 2019. It just never quite told anyone the whole story.